On Moynihan. Today it is Mary, the disciple of Christ. With that, I give you Brother Shawn Moynihan.
Thank you, brother. We'll do a sound check. Can you hear me in the back? Yep. So, today we are going to cover Mary the disciple from her return from Egypt to the last week in Jesus' life. Each of these events that we're going to take a look at could be a whole class. So it's kind of funny, when I started doing this study, I thought, I really want to do a study on Mary, but will I have enough material for a whole week? Well, each of these events could be, a whole class, so we're going to motor, so buckle up. Now, Mary had a unique discipleship challenge. On one hand, Jesus was the son of her womb, right? That's from Proverbs 31, the words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him, what, my son, what son of my womb, what son of my vows. And on the other hand, he is her Lord. And that tension is expressed in Luke 11. And as it happened, as he spoke these things, that a certain woman from the crowd raised her voice and said to him, blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast which nursed you. But he said, more than that, blessed are those who hear the word of God and keep it. So there's this tension that is in every parent and adult-child relationship where your adult children get better at stuff than you are. So you adapt in various ways. So when my kids started beating me one-on-one in basketball, I retired. But it's really amazing to see your kids just, do things that are just so much beyond what we were able to do. So I'm going to give you a silly example, but it's true. So our youngest son, Owen, is a landscape architect, and during COVID, he worked at our house. Now, we did a bunch of landscaping, and the landscaper that I was working with did not do a very good job. So I thought, okay, I can handle this. I'm used to problem solving. I'm used to dealing with difficult people. I'm used to persuading people. I will be able to deal with this, no problem. I was spectacularly unsuccessful at doing that. I met with a guy many times. Nothing happened. So Owen said, let me talk to him. So the guy arrives, Owen's there, I'm there as like a third party just observing. In less than 5 minutes, Owen had the landscape guy not only committed to make all the changes that we needed, but at the end he came over and apologized to me. And I'm just like, you are so much better than me at this. It's amazing. So that natural tension was heightened for someone in Mary's unique position. So Mary is a figure on the cosmic stage, Chris Maunder writes, helping to bring in a new relationship between God and Israel and representative of disciples past and present. And Mary is keenly aware that she is one generation of God's children founded on God's covenant love. And his mercy, the Greek is elios, the Septuagint equivalent is chesed, is on those who fear him from generation to generation. Mary knows that the foundation of God's relationship with us is his unconditional covenant love, his mercy for us. So Mary, Joseph, and Jesus are in Egypt. They're called back. We read in Matthew 2, now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. And he arose and took the young child and his mother and came to the land of Israel. So it was to fulfill the prophecy of Hosea 11, out of Egypt, I called my son. But there's another messianic psalm that Mary's mind would have gone to for sure, and that is Psalm 80. We read, and the vineyard which your right hand has planted, and the branch, and that word is literally son, that you made strong for yourself. Let your hand be upon the man of your right hand, upon the Son of Man, whom you made strong for yourself. So it's talking about this vine that's coming out of Egypt. And I think that this is really crucial because early in her relationship with Jesus, Mary was moved to understand the concept of Jesus in connection to God's right hand. And it seems like understanding Psalm 110 appears to unlock a correct understanding of Christ. That's why it's the most frequently quoted Old Testament passage in the New Testament, because those disciples really believed in the effectiveness and understanding of that particular verse. But for most disciples, this did not understanding happen until after the resurrection. So the family was directed divinely to Nazareth, or branch town, rather than Judea. We read in Matthew 2 that was warned in a dream, and he turned aside to the region of Galilee and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. So that seems to be a fulfillment of Isaiah 11, and there shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And then it really talks about the development of Jesus. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. And there's also the connection that Mary inevitably would have made with branch, and that is with Zechariah 6, and the idea that the man whose name is the branch would come to the temple. Now, there's a very, very tragic thing that confronted them when they returned home to Nazareth. After Herod's death, the Roman general Varus crushed a rebellion lining the road from Sepphoris, which is about 6 kilometers away from Nazareth, with 2,000 crucified Jewish rebels. So this is the kind of scene that Joseph and Mary would have confronted. This is a typical Roman practice when a rebellion was put down. So it seems like early in Mary's life as a parent, the idea that that crucifixion was a possibility for anybody who came afoul of the rulers, that seemed to be something that was brought home in kind of tragic and stark relief for her. So let's take a look at how Mary might have viewed Jesus from age 2 to 12. We know that Luke 2:40 says that he grew and waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. I think, too, that she would have been thinking, because Simeon's prophecy in the temple talked about a light unto the Gentiles, I think she would have been thinking of Isaiah 49 as well. The Lord has called me from the womb. From the matrix of my mother he has made mention of my name, and he has made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he has hidden me, and made me a polished shaft. In his quiver he has hidden me, and he said to me, you are my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Out of Israel I have called my son, you are my servant, O Israel. And so why does Isaiah 49 connect there? Well, of course, Simeon's prophecy alluded to the verse right after this that talks about the light unto the Gentiles that Christ would be. And I think that Mary probably took comfort in this passage because it really talks about divine protection and safety, especially as she walked under that horrific canopy of crucified people, that in the shadow of his hand Jesus had been hidden, and in his quiver he had been hidden. So she took comfort in this passage with its message of divine protection and safety. I think it would have been apparent very early, as it says in Psalm 119, I have more understanding than all my teachers, for your testimonies are my meditation. Now, let's take a look at the first example. Jesus is a son of Moses. So we know the story, don't we? As was their custom, the family of Mary and Joseph went south for Passover. We know that this was not completely required that Mary attend, but it was a measure of their piety that they did, that she did. And they went in a huge group. So they went down to celebrate. Now this is a big event. Brother Lean Rittmeyer writes, "Now he was 12 years of age, and his first words are recorded for us. Under the law, attendance at the feast in Jerusalem was obligatory for boys from the age of 13, a birthday that was a milestone in the life of a Jewish boy when they became a son of the commandment, or bar mitzvah. In this practice, the legal age was pushed forward by 1 or 2 years, so that Jesus, after he had passed his 12th year, came up from Jerusalem for the Passover with his family." So this is a big event. Now, we read in Luke that when they had finished the days, as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother did not know it, but supposing him to have been in the company, they went a day's journey and sought him among their relatives and acquaintances. So people traveled in large groups, we know, for safety, and it speaks of a cohesive community, doesn't it? That Joseph and Mary felt completely comfortable with others ensuring Jesus' safety. Now, Joseph and Mary find out that Jesus is not with them and he's not in their company. So, what do? Well, of course, like any parent, they run back. I don't know if you've misplaced a child. I know that Kathy and I did one time in particular. It was the Saturday after Bible school. Great Lakes Bible School. We stopped at a big mall in northern Illinois, Guernsey's Mills or something, I think. And so our oldest son, Braden, was just finished grade 7. And so we couldn't find him for 2 hours. And I can still picture him walking when we finally see him. He was wearing a plaid shirt and a Michigan State hat and a Michigan State shirt underneath. To this day, I have a little bit of PTSD whenever I see the Michigan State Spartan, to be honest. And of course, like parents everywhere, when they're reunited, you don't know whether to kiss them or kill them. And so we just imagine the anguish. And in fact, when Mary says, "Your father and I sought thee sorrowing," that's the same word that's used to describe kind of incredible torments. So 3 days later, they found Jesus sitting in the temple, listening to the teachers and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was surprised at how much he knew and at the answers he gave. When his parents found him, they were amazed. His mother said, "Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been very worried, and we have been searching for you." Jesus answered, "Why did you have to look for me? Didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he meant. Okay, so only Mary speaks, right? Joseph doesn't speak, only Mary speaks, and her personality just jumps off the page. So let's unpack a little bit. So 3 days. You know, that's indicative, of course, scripturally of a big change. We know that the sign in Cana happened on the 3rd day. Jesus talks about the sign of his resurrection connected to the 3rd day. So 3 suggests a big change. Only Mary speaks. Joseph is silent. And watch how Jesus turns around Mary's comments here. "Your father." And Jesus pushes right back on that, and he said, "Don't talk to me about my father. I'm in my Father's house." And again, that Greek word, "sought thee sorrowing," is intense pain. Jesus asks, "Why don't you understand?" So I think this was a light bulb moment for Jesus, because I think that he was under the impression that Mary especially had the understanding that he had. So, like with Moses, there was a gap in understanding. Moses thought that his own people would understand that God was going to use him to give him freedom, but they didn't understand. We read in Acts 7. So, we see that right away there is a pushback of, okay, I thought you understood this, but you didn't understand. So Jesus recalibrates. We read in Luke 2, "Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them." And again, Mary, that thoughtful, reflective person, she treasured all that was said in her heart. We read that Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. So it seems that Joseph and Mary's family became fairly well known and well regarded, both locally around Nazareth and in the broader region of Galilee. We know that from a couple passages, right? That just as, Samuel grew in favor, we see someone like Christ growing in favor. And just as Samuel became understood to be someone who was someone to watch, a potential leader, perhaps that was something that occurred with Jesus as well. We read in Luke 1 that, in John 1, that we have found him whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So that's thrown in, I think, by way of context, right? It's not to provide additional historical detail. It's to say, yeah, this is a family that we know. In Luke 4, is this not Joseph's son? And this is a really interesting one in John 6 because this is in the synagogue of Capernaum. So it's not in Nazareth. It's across the Sea of Galilee. It's in a different spot. It's a more regional thing. And yet the people say, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? And then, of course, the two examples of the second rejection that we'll take a look at Nazareth, where they talk about Jesus as the son of Mary and the carpenter's son. Now, Jesus lived near Sepphoris. This is a picture of the amphitheater at Sepphoris. And I always like this picture because it shows the folly of biblical criticism. Because it became fashionable to say that Jesus obviously didn't use the word hypocrite. Because hypocrite was a word that had to do with the Greek theater. It had to do with wearing a mask. How would Jesus know about masks and the theater? He wouldn't know anything about theaters. He was this unlettered peasant from Nazareth. So then in 1932, an archaeologist named Leroy Waterman started to unearth Sepphoris, right next to Nazareth. And one of the big things he found was a huge theater. So, it's quite clear that Jesus would have been familiar with all those terms that the biblical critics suggested that he would have no ability to understand. So Sepphoris was rebuilt and fortified by Herod Antipas. It was his capital until AD 19. It was on the Via Maris. It was on the way of the sea, a really important trade route. It was about an hour's walk from Nazareth, and it had a Roman garrison. And so we can see that as Joseph and Mary returned to Nazareth, and Joseph is a tecton, kind of a general contractor, a worker in wood and stone, that they are situated next to a city that has to be rebuilt. And so Mary no doubt gave thanks for the providential opportunity for work for her family. So how would Mary have interpreted Jesus' ministry and how it would unfold? So I think that she probably went to a passage in Isaiah 52 that kind of talks about the progression of the ministry of Messiah. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted. So act wisely. Well, we see that was the definition of Jesus' first 30 years. The start of John the Baptist's ministry must have kick-started Mary's expectations that Jesus would act. And John was really clear that he wasn't Messiah, but that he was preparing the way for Messiah. So Jesus spent those first 30 years acting wisely. Now, Mary knew that Jesus was the Christ and John didn't. We know that because in Matthew 3, Jesus comes to John, and it's really a powerful statement of how well regarded Jesus was, where John, even though he doesn't know that this is the Christ, defers. So clearly Jesus was highly respected. Now, John is pretty clear that he doesn't know until the sign occurs. He says in John 1, I did not know him. Of course, he knew him personally, but didn't know he was the Messiah. But he who sent me to baptize with water said to me, upon whom you see the Spirit descending and remaining on him, this is he who baptizes with the Holy Spirit. So, obviously, Jesus acted wisely. John attempted to defer to him, and then John's understanding of who the Christ was confirmed with the sign that had been appointed. So, how would Mary have interpreted that? My servant shall act wisely, he shall be high. Well, can you get much higher than the divine voice, you are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased? So when Mary heard of the baptism and heard of the miraculous events surrounding the baptism, she would have thought, okay, the second part of the ministry of Messiah is unfolding. Then there was 40 days in the wilderness. Then Jesus returned to John and gathered his first disciples, and then he heads home in time for a family wedding in Cana. So imagine Jesus and Mary's conversation when Jesus comes back home after all these incredible events. You know, we know when kids come home to visit us and we say, anything new? Yeah, and of course the answer is no. So hopefully Jesus was a little bit more forthcoming. It seems that they spoke about Jesus having been given the Holy Spirit without measure. I think we can infer that because Mary had a faith that was complete in Jesus' ability to solve an unsolvable problem. And we know that this was the first sign that Jesus did. Did they talk about John the Baptist? Did they talk about the next steps in Jesus' ministry? I find it impossible to believe that after Jesus had begun his ministry and these tumultuous things had happened, that Mary and Jesus didn't talk about it. So they're at the wedding in Cana. And there is a big problem. They run out of wine. So Mary solves this problem. Mary, in this narrative, is a commanding presence. She's influential, people defer to her, she's a community problem solver. And Jesus said to her, woman, and that's the Greek word gune, but it's a respectful and affectionate term. It's not a term of distancing. When he says, what does your concern have to do with me? Really, that should be better translated. What's happening here is not either of our concerns. My hour has not yet come. And then his mother doesn't respond to him. He just says to the servants, whatever he says to do to you, do. Now, this is a community problem. It would be just a horrific embarrassment and really really negative for the whole community for the wedding to run out of wine. And so, you know, who solves community problems? Well, community leaders solve community problems. And so, although Mary didn't have any official position, she is the one who solves this problem. And as so often is the case with wise women, she solves it through the strength of her relationships. Now, Jesus pushes back and says, my hour is not yet come. And that seems to be indicative in the Gospel of John of a crisis point, right? Jesus talks about that in John 7 and John 8, my hour is not yet come. But his mother doesn't even respond. He says, whatever he says to you, do it. So I think that Mary prompted Messiah to begin to show himself. Mary believes, despite seeing no previous sign, that Jesus will solve the problem through miraculous means. Whatever he says to you, do it. Now, if you had a mission statement as a disciple, that should be it, right? Whatever he says to you, do it. In fact, I don't have any tattoos, but if I was going to get a tattoo, I think on one side I would get follow me, because I like short things because I need to remember it. Follow me. And on the other hand, I'd have whatever he says to do for you to do, do it. It's kind of a powerful statement of complete faith as a disciple. Jesus' hour had in fact come because we see the result of the miracle that he did. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. So we see that the signs were encouraging people to believe. It was a positive thing, and clearly there wasn't any kind of discomfort in Mary and Jesus' relationship, because he makes a point of staying with his family after this. In fact, Jesus would later go on to say that the signs are the proof that he is the Christ. In John 10 we read, in his response to the question, "If you are the Christ, tell us plainly," he says, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me." So let's revisit Mary's unique discipleship challenge. So does Mary's experience at Cana make it more difficult for her to be Jesus' disciple? John was able to navigate the fact that he needed to pull back from the scene. He was able to do that with grace, right? He said, he must increase, but I must decrease. He who comes from above is above all, but he who is of the earth is earthly and speaks of the earth. He who comes from heaven is above all. And I just wonder if Mary's success in encouraging Jesus' first sign made it more difficult for her to pull back and just be a follower. I wonder if that was in the back of her mind in another event that we'll see in Mark. That if she just had the chance to talk to Jesus, she would be able to help her son. But we'll see, he was not her son anymore, he was her Lord. Now, we also have to think, as Jesus started his ministry, why doesn't Mary the disciple follow Jesus as other women did, including her own sister? So why didn't she do that? Well, hopefully we'll come to an answer by the end. Because, as a Jewish woman, Mary had agency. There's a really thoughtful New Testament scholar named Amy Jill Levine, and she writes, Jewish women owned their own homes, were not restricted to women's quarters, but appear in public gatherings and had freedom of travel. They had access to their own funds, sought health care from physicians, participated in public rituals such as funerals, and worshiped in synagogues and in the Jerusalem temple. Jewish women chose to follow Jesus when their husbands did not. So again, why didn't Mary travel with Jesus as a disciple? We know from Luke 8 that many women did, and we know that at the end of Jesus' life, many women who followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, were there looking on from afar. And here we see Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons, who is Salome. So it's interesting, and you kind of wonder the conversations that Salome and Mary had. Okay, so Jesus' next act is cleansing the temple, and Mary would say, yep, that's what I'm expecting Messiah to do. From Zechariah 6, behold the man whose name is the branch. He shall branch out and shall build the temple of the Lord. He shall build the temple of the Lord. He shall bear the glory and shall sit and rule on his throne. So, this powerful cleansing of the temple. Now, there's an important verse. His disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. So let's think about that. In Psalm 69, because zeal for your house has eaten me up or consumed me. Does anybody remember what comes right before this verse? Anybody remember? I have become a stranger to my brothers and an alien to my mother's children. So this very act that would seem to suggest that Messiah was on his way was prophesied to be one that would create contention in Mary's household. And we see this play out over the next little while. See, Mary understood that she was part of something new that was happening in God's relationship with his people. And she looked forward to the dramatic changes that would be enacted by Christ. So if she thinks about Isaiah 52, behold, my servant shall act wisely, yep. He shall be high, yep, baptized, and lifted up. Well, people were expecting a king. But Christ was clear early in his teaching and repeatedly in his ministry of saying what lifted up really meant. It didn't mean being lifted up as a king, it meant being lifted up as the serpent in the wilderness was lifted up. And the mismatch of these expectations became a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. So Mary is going to have to endure seeing how her expectation of Messiah and her faith in Christ plays out against the backdrop of others. So let's take a look at the first rejection at Nazareth. Luke records rejection at Nazareth early in Jesus' ministry. Matthew and Mark, I believe, document a rejection in Nazareth that occurred in the middle of Jesus' ministry. A couple reasons for that. Luke's gospel is generally written in chronological fashion. And Luke's account has some significant differences with the two other accounts. There's the first century Jewish version of the daily readings mentioned, Isaiah 61, and there's the attempted murder, and there's the miraculous escape. So we see in Luke 4 something quite tragic. Starting in verse 16, and he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah, and when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, and he has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and set at liberty those who are oppressed." So there's an interesting word here. It says where Jesus was brought up, and actually that Greek word is trepho. And every other place in Scripture that's translated as fed. So it's kind of interesting, right? The gospel writer's getting us to understand this was home cooking for Jesus, right? This is his synagogue. This is where he was fed. It seems like Jesus customarily read and by implication taught. And what he says this in Isaiah, reading this is exactly what Mary was expecting. Remember, Mary proclaimed, "He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. He has put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the lowly." This is what Mary was expecting. So he closes the scroll, gives it back to the attendants and sits down, which is weird because he should have stayed up there and kept talking. Everybody looks at him. He says, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And so they started to say relatively positive things about him. And the exhortation was going so well until those in the synagogue, when they had heard these things, were filled with wrath and rose up and thrust him out of the city. And they led him to the brow of the hill on which their city was built, that they might throw him down over the cliff. Then passing through the midst of them, he went his way. What made the people that Jesus knew best want to kill him? Well, he was unsparing in his declaration. Jesus forced those in Nazareth to try to see him as Christ. Now, again, let's put ourselves in Mary's shoes. Mary had spent her whole life worried that the rulers were going to kill Jesus. And yet the first real attempt to kill him is from the people that knew him best. The people that she would have least expected to do this. You know, as a parent, we spend so much time worried about the impact of the world on our kids, and rightly so. But I really connect with Mary here because, like Mary as a parent, I was surprised and unprepared for the harmful impact from those in our community of faith on my kids, especially my two younger ones. And I struggle with this, and the unity effort that has gone on for so long in Ontario really negatively impacted my two younger kids. And the things that they witnessed are quite a stumbling block for them to come into our community. And I struggle with forgiveness for those folks that have put those stumbling blocks there. And I wonder, Mary, did she later on get to a place where she could forgive those people who are trying to kill Jesus? Think of how painful that would be to get that sense of betrayal. Indeed, a source will pierce the soul of you yourself. And it's hard to imagine Mary and her children passively accepting the attempt to kill Jesus. I mean, I just can't picture Mary sitting there. I can't picture James and Joseph sitting there, his brothers. So they must have been restrained in some way. What a powerful, powerful example of the sword-piercing Mary. So Messiah was not according to the people's expectations. Like a young plant we read in Isaiah, or a root that sprouts in dry ground, the servant grew up obeying the Lord. He wasn't some handsome king. Nothing about the way he looked made him attractive to us. And this is the incident at Nazareth synagogue in a nutshell. We thought we knew who he was, and then we were surprised. Now, the next instance that we're going to take a look at is Mary and Jesus' brothers go to where Jesus is teaching near the Sea of Galilee. So the purpose of their visit seems to be that people, and the Greek is a little bit unclear. It literally says people from beside Jesus. So it could be family, could be not family, could be friends. In Mark 3:21, they say that they need to go lay hold of him, for they said he is out of his mind. Now, it's very clear that that isn't what Jesus' mom and his brothers are there for, because there's a separation in the narrative. So we can't assume that this is what the family was thinking. So they get there, and they physically can't get near Jesus because of the crowd. They send word, perhaps to cousins James and John, that they can't get in to see Jesus and want to talk to him. Jesus doesn't go out to them. He rebukes them from afar. And apparently Jesus' family doesn't wait for him and leaves to go back home. So I think that Mary's son wanted to take Jesus home. I think they were worried about him. Because out of his mind, it kind of really means knocked from standing, not necessarily has a demon. The family's concern was that Jesus would be killed because people were already recognizing him as the Christ. In verse 9 it says he was so popular that he ran the risk of being trampled. But I think, like the wedding at Cana, Mary had a different sense of what Christ should be doing, except this time Jesus was going to rightly reject her. This time Mary's Lord, not her son, rebukes her in the strongest possible terms. So again, we revisit Mary's unique discipleship challenge. I think this is Jesus' way of saying, I'm here as the bridegroom. And as the bridegroom, I need to tend to the bride. A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. John the Baptist was the friend of the bridegroom, and he had to let go. And I think Jesus refuses to talk to Mary because he has declared himself as the bridegroom. He says that earlier in Mark 2, right? He says, can the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? Jesus is saying, the bridegroom is here. And because he's the bridegroom, he no longer has to explain himself to his mother. Now, there's a parallel here with Miriam. We see that Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses, and Simeon said that child would be a sign which would be spoken against. So Miriam suggests that there's some level of confusion there. I think it's fair to say that Miriam was much more strident than Mary. But it ends up in the same place, right? Miriam is shut out of the camp for a time, and Jesus is excluding Mary. He doesn't go out to talk to her. Miriam learns and is restored to Moses, and I think Mary learns when her sons don't, and is then restored to Jesus. Now, I see we're getting short on time, but I think that the death of John the Baptist worsened the divide, because I think here's a concrete example where Mary was really starting to think, what will be the end of Jesus' ministry? I think Mary was starting to understand that Jesus being lifted up was going to be fulfilled in a way that pierced her soul. So there's a second rejection at Nazareth as well. He comes to Nazareth in his own country. His teaching causes astonishment. They remark on his wisdom and mighty works. Carpenter's son, they say, son of Mary, talk about his brothers and sisters. And then in both passages, there's this statement that they are offended. And that word, of course, is a stumbling block. And as Mary heard those words, that people were offended at her son, at her Lord, I think her mind undoubtedly went to Isaiah 8. He will be a holy place both for Israel and Judah, and he will be a stone that causes people to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. See, Mary, I think, begins to accept that Israel will reject Jesus as the son of David. And the progression to me seems inevitable. She sees Jesus rejected by family, as foretold in Psalm 69, rejected by the community, and rejected by the nation. And Jesus himself talks about this. He says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." I like to think that when Mary heard that, she thought, can I just get away from swords just for a second? I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against his mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those in his own household. I think Mary began to understand that the stone that the builders needed for the cornerstone would be rejected by the nation. And I think Mary, that whole passage of Isaiah from 49 through the end of 53 is so resonant of Messiah. I think she probably visited that as well. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. She saw that play out at Nazareth a couple times. The last straw seems to be the example in John 7. So John Maxwell places this event in the final year of Jesus' life. We read in John 7, beginning in verse 1, "After these things Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. His brothers therefore said to him, 'Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples may also see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret, while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world, for even his brothers did not believe in him.' Then Jesus said to them, 'My time is not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it, that its works are evil. You go up to this feast. I am not yet going up to this feast, for my time is not yet come.' When he said these things to them, he remained in Galilee. But when his brothers had gone up, then he also went up to the feast, not openly, but as it were in secret. Then the Jews sought him at the feast and said, 'Where is he?' And there was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said, 'He is good.' Others said, 'No, on the contrary, he deceives the people.' However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. Now, at about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up to the temple and taught." So why doesn't Mary act like Solomon and become one of Jesus' disciples and follow him around? She can't, because she has to stay home and lead her fractured family. Because she loved those brothers that could not accept that Jesus was their Lord. Think of the prayers that Mary would have offered. We're going to get to that in a sec. Jesus' brothers don't believe he is the Christ. They replicate the wilderness temptation, right? If you are the Christ, throw yourself off the pinnacle of the temple. Jesus' brothers are replicating that temptation. And Mary always understood that Jesus was in danger, and his brothers are just blissfully unaware. And at that very feast, the brothers, we see in verse 40 to 41 of John 7, they would have seen so many other people believe that this is Christ. In fact, the only reason for people not believing was they said, well, he's from Nazareth. And the brothers knew, no, he was born in Bethlehem. Okay, we'll wrap up. So the last two scenes of Mary's discipleship. God willing, we're going to talk about that next day. I'd like you to just stop and think of Mary's prayer life. We're going to close on this. When she was in a family who were their other sons who were refusing to accept Christ, think of the prayers that she would have offered for those unbelieving children. And, you know, if you're like Kathy and I, and you're blessed with children, some of whom are in our community of faith, and some of whom aren't, you can imagine the depth of prayers that Mary would have offered for those children to see the light and the truth. But as we hope in our family, Mary's family has a happy ending. Because as Kathy and I like to say, our two oldest are in the community of faith, and our two youngest aren't yet. And so it was with Mary. Because we see that the brothers become believers in the community of faith. In the case of James, not just a believer, but a pillar. So God willing, we'll take a look at the last two scenes of Mary's discipleship tomorrow. Mary at the foot of the cross, and Mary in Acts 1, where we read, "These all continued with one accord in prayer and supplication with the women, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers."